DraftKings.
Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now.
Cha-ching!
Go to prizepicks.com.
You can use promo code DraftKings over on Underdog Fantasy.
$150 in free bets.
$150 in free bets.
Bam! 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 The gambling bookies themselves are reaching out to referees in order to influence outcomes. Again, that's promo code PrizePicks.
Is anyone else mildly concerned about gambling's influence on independent sports creators? Now listen, I work for a living. I get that you gotta do what you gotta do to put food on the table. And the partnership makes perfect sense. For an independent outlet, the best way to grow and challenge traditional media is with an influx of cash. And right now, sportsbooks are big spenders. And besides, sports gambling is a legal enterprise that adults are fully free to associate with. If it's what they're passionate about, there's no reason why John Q. Thinking Football can't tell his fans to use his code when they download DraftKings. Actually, wait, isn't he the guy with the injury lawyer sponsor?
Morgan & Morgan is America's largest
DraftKings.
I don't know why that's funny to me. I suppose I should come clean. The title of this video, like gambling is ruining sports or whatever, is a little bit of clickbait. I'm not going to tell you that sports betting is evil and destroying the game. However, I do want to have a reasonable, well-wrought discussion on the implications of growing proximity between sports media, traditional and independent, and sports gambling. Quick note before we get started, I'm going to be talking about both daily fantasy and sports books throughout this video. They are meaningfully distinct concepts, but for the purposes of this discussion, I'll be using them interchangeably, since they both represent ways in which players can win real money by speculating on the outcome of sports games. Before we get started, it's worth a brief foray into how we actually got to the current state of affairs in regards to the legality of sports gambling. In 1992, Congress passed the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, or PASPA, which functionally made sports gambling illegal in all but a few cases. Sports gambling was already mostly outlawed at the state level starting in the early 20th century. It was generally viewed as crooked or untrustworthy because of events like the Black Sox scandal of 1919 and match fixing in boxing that sort of forged a link between corruption and sports gambling that always loomed over the American consciousness for the last 100 years or so. Nevertheless, in 2014, PASPA began to fall apart. That year, New Jersey passed a law that repealed the state's ban on sports betting. Now, the ensuing legal battle is a little technical, but I'll do my best to simplify. Essentially, the NCAA and every major professional sports league sued to stop the bill from going into effect, arguing that repealing the state's gambling law violated PASPA and would harm the image of professional and collegiate sports. Former NBA Commissioner David Stern wrote about this, saying, "The NBA cannot be compensated in damages for the harm that sports gambling poses to the fundamental bonds of loyalty and devotion between fans and teams. Basically, gambling decreases trust and integrity in sports." New Jersey's counterargument is an interesting one. They're going to say that the law does violate PASPA, but that actually PASPA is unconstitutional under the 10th Amendment. If you slept through civics class, the 10th Amendment basically says that all power not specifically granted to Congress, the federal government, in the Constitution is left to the states. PASPA prohibits states from operating or authorizing sports gambling operations in its wording. By telling states that they can't authorize a sports gambling law, New Jersey argues that Congress is telling them how to enforce their own laws, which they can't do under the 10th Amendment. New Jersey actually loses this case in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, basically one level below the Supreme Court, but New Jersey appeals and the Supreme Court decides to hear the case. If you know anything about the attitude of the Supreme Court the past decade, the writing was on the wall here. In 2018, the Supreme Court strikes down PASPA in a case Murphy versus NCAA, finding that the law did indeed violate the 10th Amendment. States were now free to legalize sports gambling if they wished. Since 2018, over 35 states have legalized sports gambling in some form, and more than $220 billion in bets have been placed. However, it hasn't all been smooth sailing. A Pew Research survey in 2022 found that only 16% of surveyed Americans thought legalized sports betting was a good thing for sports. 33% thought it was a bad thing, and the other half felt neutral. That same Pew study found that of the people who place sports bets, a majority did so via casual wagers. Think betting $5 between your friends, not through online sports books and casinos. Data for 2023 is less complete, but preliminary numbers suggest that only around 30% of adults place more than one bet a month. Now, why do I bring this up? Because before we continue this discussion, it's important to remember that sportsbook advertisers want to create the illusion that everyone is gambling. By leveraging our fear of missing out, we're less likely to view sports gambling with suspicion. Someone who might be on the fence will think, well, everyone's doing it, so it's probably not that bad. It reminds me a lot of this thing they did with us in high school. We were asked to fill out a survey that asked if we smoked pot, and then to guess what percentage of kids in our school smoked pot. When they showed us the results, about 22% of kids said that they had smoked before, but people guessed that on average, 70% of kids were actively smoking pot. The takeaway was clear. 50% of the kids were lying. Now, let's tackle the core assertion of this video, that there is a worrying link between independent sports media and gambling companies. I alluded to this before, but the fact of the matter is, sports creators are completely within their rights to promote and associate with any legal endeavor of their choosing. If I can, though, I'd like to offer a few points of consideration. A survey done by Seton Hall found that while Americans were placing sports bets more often, their attitudes towards gambling as an institution was not exactly as bullish. I'm just going to throw out a few numbers. 47% of the self-described sports fans in the respondent pool believed that legalized gambling was creating a problem in America. 58% wanted restrictions on gambling ads. 68% had neutral or negative reactions to viewing gambling ads. Over 50% said that there shouldn't be live odds or gambling ads during a game. And 56% felt that the proliferation of gambling content is improperly exposed to minors. Now, this is just one survey, but I think there are a couple of axioms here we can extrapolate. Sports fans are generally favorable towards gambling, but they don't like gambling ads. This makes sense, no one likes ads. But it's deeper than that. People have reservation about the content of ads. They have reservations about the timing of ads. They don't like that these ads are potentially being served to kids. It doesn't take a logician to see the growing hypocrisy in gambling and sport. A viewer is bombarded with ads about how daily fantasy is the best way to watch football, with Calvin Ridley fresh off his gambling suspension. Obviously, what Calvin Ridley did is still wrong. You unequivocally should not be allowed to gamble as an athlete, coach, team affiliate, owner, whatever. But that isn't the issue. The issue is the optics. Traditional media's stance is clear. ESPN Bet, ESPN's new sportsbook, is a good microcosm for this. Last year, Disney CEO Bob Iger said that ESPN was losing money and that needed to change. That's why ESPN got so much of their talent in 2023 and brought in people like Pat McAfee. They're doing what they will feel will put them in the best position to protect their bottom line. For the same reason, they made the $2 billion deal with Penn Entertainment. It's not hard to see the concerns people have with this. ESPN, leaders in sports journalism, now have vested financial interest in sports gambling. What happens when a developing story might affect their bottom line? Who gets the primetime coverage, the odds makers or the news reporters? How separate are the two entities? It's one thing to have ESPN the news outlet and ESPN Bet, but once ESPN's own journalists start engaging with ESPN Bet and covering it, a huge amount of journalistic integrity is thrown out the window. Now, it would be naive to say that ESPN isn't aware of these concerns, as are professional sports leagues. It's for this reason I'm sure that they so ardently defended PASPA. However, Disney has some smart financial analysts, and I'm sure that they've calculated that the slice of the $220 billion pie outweighs these risks. But ESPN is in a position to make this decision. They have the brand recognition and financial resources to pivot if their gambling focus starts to backfire. For as problematic as ESPN's gambling relationships are, they're a strong enough brand that ESPN will always be recognizable as a sports news outlet to the layperson, regardless of the future of ESPN Bet. And if ESPN can't turn things around and they find themselves insolvent, they have Disney backing them up. Yes, Bob Iger has floated selling the company, but I think that's more indicative of his priorities and what has been a rough spell for Disney than it is a death knell for ESPN. Independent creators online are in a different boat. They aren't losing money, they're gaining market share as online generations mature. Yes, this growth period invites the injection of capital that gambling ads can provide, but they aren't in a negative status quo. Independent creators do not need to drastically change their business model at this point. At the same time, brand image for them is a huge premium. They don't have the cachet of Disney and ESPN. Independent creators are their own brand value. For this reason, I worry about the rush for independent creators to partner with sportsbooks and daily fantasy apps. In my opinion, this isn't a partnership that they desperately need to survive. They stand to gain much less than ESPN. They are never going to make as much money as ESPN Bet will, but they can ultimately lose so much more. Brett Kollmann is hands down the best football creator online, and like many others, he takes sponsorships from online sportsbooks. Most notably is his Bootleg Football podcast, which is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy, a daily fantasy app. Now, I think Brett is about the best you can hope for when it comes to betting advertisements. His sponsorships are clearly labeled and disclosed. He never insinuates that real football fans spend money on games. It's pretty harmless. I have a couple of concerns about his delivery, specifically his occasional use of the term risk-free in some of his ad reads, but nothing major. However, it's getting to the point where independent media brands themselves are becoming linked to these sports betting outlets. When I think of Bootleg Football, I inevitably also think of Underdog Fantasy. Just like when I think of John Boy Media, I think of a floating head telling me about DraftKings. In short, online sports media and online sports gambling are becoming ubiquitous. You almost assume you'll see a daily fantasy ad on YouTube now, just as much as you expect to see SeatGeek or HelloFresh. I fear that this might hurt online creators' growth at some point. It's completely anecdotal evidence, so I don't put too much stock in it, but I have a couple of friends who have specifically abstained from diving into the deeper side of football breakdowns because they associate in-depth analysis online with betting content. What happens when consumer sentiment around sportsbooks and daily fantasy craters? We're in a boom right now, but there's a reason I started with the history of gambling legislation in America. The past shows us that public opinion will turn at some point. When those 50% of consumers who feel neutral start to pick a side, online creators might very well soon find themselves with significant financial ties to unpopular advertisers, just like tobacco ads on cartoons were in the 60s. Go check out any comment thread under something like the Week 17 Lions-Cowboys game, and you'll see people decrying the growing proximity of sportsbooks to major professional sports. Now, people have and will always cry foul when their favorite team loses, but still, the point stands. Hitching your wagon on a sportsbook is an accident waiting to happen. Now, I do think that these large, independent personal brands can withstand losing these sponsorships should push come to shove from a financial standpoint, but it brings to question editorial freedom. We saw these concerns with the launching of ESPN Bet. As daily fantasy and sportsbook operations get larger and more intertwined with sports operation, that veneer of integrity starts to crack. I should be clear, I don't think that any major creator has compromised their own content because of intervention from a gambling-related sponsor, but that's not the point of editorial standards. You don't wait to start asking about conflicts of interest. It's a level of scrutiny that you hold from day one. When I talk about editorial scrutiny, this does bring me to an important tangent. A vast majority of online sports creators are really more in the business of entertainment than they are journalism. A lot of them blur that line, they're more infotainment. I think the journalism versus entertainer distinction is important, but it doesn't really matter in this case. Even if you aren't Adam Schefter, anyone with an online following has a duty of care to be transparent about how they're coming up with their ideas and what factors influence their content. This duty doesn't necessarily arise out of a journalistic obligation, but it exists nonetheless. Quite simply, there needs to be a framework for how accountability and disclosure works in the sportsbook influencer relationship. I don't know what it'll look like because, frankly, I'm not privy to the kind of business dealings going on. Part of this reason why I'm making this video is because I hope that someone with information and experience will find this and educate me, but simply as a viewer, I don't see a consistent ethical standard being established. It's going to be up to content creators to create and maintain methods to safeguard integrity. I just hope to see it develop preemptively, not as a reaction to some scandal. Alright, we discussed some grounded, logical points regarding sportsbook advertising and independent and traditional media. I'd like, if I can now, to talk a little more informally. If you don't want to hear opinions and appeals to emotions and only care about facts and logic, skip to this part in the video. I repeat, appeals to pathos incoming. Proceed at your own risk. Alright, we good? Sports gambling content is boring as fuck. Some people like it, they're entitled to, but good god, it's so overbearing and dry. I get so bored every time I hear someone talk about their picks for the game. Most of the time it's just like guessing. Will CJ Stroud throw over 250 yards? CMC over under 0.5 touchdowns? Yes, you can apply analytics and skill to your picks, but predicting individual stats is always going to be more of a crapshoot than analyzing how a team overall plays. Some of the magic of good sports analysis is the guy who can tell you about the little things that teams do to win games, the micro adjustments you can make in this 22-man game of chess, or the people who can tell you about the wild cards, the way under the radar players that can be used to have a chance and affect the game in ways we aren't expecting. So much of that gets replaced with CeeDee Lamb anytime TD is a lock. We're at complete overexposure in traditional media. DraftKings and FanDuel ads come on every 5 minutes when I'm watching a game. Every time I go to ESPN, I now see content for ESPN Bet. I think it's a good thing that we're seeing those responsible gambling ads with Kurt Warner. But isn't it kind of sad that we need to teach those in the first place? Isn't it indicative that we've gone a little bit too far when you need to start teaching people not to chase their losses and bet what they can't afford to lose? Yes, gambling addictions have and will always exist, but that doesn't mean that we should ignore the fact that it very obviously is becoming more of a problem, and it's affecting a wider range of people. Now, I get it, gambling content is entertainment. The Bad Beat segments on Scott Van Pelt are funny, and there's always something kind of wholesome about seeing two guys on a podcast giving each other grief for their picks always being wrong, but it's much shallower a concept in my opinion. It's on the same level as seeing those huge portfolio losses on Wall Street bets. The entertainment comes from the glad that's not me feeling, that kind of morbid enjoyment we get seeing someone lose a 8-leg parlay on the last play of the game, but eventually that wears off. At the risk of getting all won't someone think of the children? Won't someone think of the children? Hell, I can't imagine being a recovering gambling addict right now, constantly being offered risk-free and bonus bets. I understand that, on a principled level, no one is responsible for protecting you except yourself. It's legal to run ads for beer, even if an alcoholic might see it. But from a moral level, does it never feel excessive? Does no one feel like we've gone beyond the pale a little bit? Again, people need to make money, I get it. And really, I don't have a solution. I don't know enough to have a solution. But sometimes it feels like we're chasing these partnerships with daily fantasy and sportsbook operations at the expense of creating a more well-rounded and inclusive product. And I don't think it's for the benefit of who independent creators are ultimately supposed to be serving, sports fans. Alright, I think I'm done. This was originally going to be a video about undisclosed gambling advertisements on social media, but frankly, I didn't want to do that. For one, I don't like calling out people, and two, I don't think it's useful. There will always be those shady creators online, and whether they're doing an undisclosed ad for prize picks or a scam gift card giveaway, they aren't what I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about what our endgame is. Already, we're seeing legislative and regulatory backlash. Lawmakers are pressuring advertisers to limit their exposure to children and at-risk groups. The American Gaming Association has been cracking down on language that talks about risk-free bets. Remember, most Americans are undecided on whether gambling is good for sports or not. As the novelty wears off and the market starts to cool, those neutral parties could very quickly change their opinion. Sportsbooks are often seen as these edgy market disruptors, but public perception can very easily swing to corrupt behemoths. History has shown that it can, and honestly will, happen at some point. The emergence of ESPN Bet has made traditional media's stance clear on this. They are fully ready to attach themselves to gambling content in their mainstream broadcasts. We see lines before the game, analysts discuss Vegas odds. In my opinion, a lot of it is to make up for lackluster personalities. The temporary excitement you can generate with sports gambling can cover for the fact that there are fewer and fewer great on-air personalities. On the contrary, independent creators are succeeding because their personalities are so great. They don't have million-dollar production crews and huge advertising budgets. They got to where they are because fans think they're interesting or funny, or they like hearing their takes on the game. Anyone with a pulse can do a pick'em spot. Traditional media has proven that. It takes a special talent to get where you are on the back of your own hard work and personality. That's what makes independent creators so great. I hate to see some shortchange themselves by using gambling as a crutch. So this video is about whether or not gambling has ruined football media. The answer is kinda. Sportsbooks, fundamentally, want to change the way fans watch football. They make more money if fans root for their picks, not for their team. It's extreme to say it's ruining the game, but it is a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift away from what traditionally drives passion and sentiment to a more profit-oriented approach. For all the prophesizing I've done about the future turmoil independent media outlets might face, none of it has come to pass yet. Independent football media is in a great place in terms of content, but there isn't a lot of transparency and there isn't a lot of accountability. The sportsbook boom will not last forever. I don't think that 15 years into the future, all fans of teams will be replaced with parlays and pick'em. At some point, the pendulum will swing in the other direction. When it does, I don't want independent creators to have to swing with them. They're emblematic of that true love of the game, if it isn't too trite a phrase. I do not know the answers, nor do I pretend to. I ask the questions I ask and bring up the points I bring up, not because I want to tear anyone down, but because I believe that they're the questions that need to be answered in order for independent media to succeed. I hope that something I've said can spark a discussion among people who are much smarter than me. I'd find myself lucky to hear what they have to say. Anyway, stay safe, y'all. Good night.